This is Scorched Vine, a Vin Noir's production of Hope's Nocturne, Chapter 4, Hope's Squeaky Annoyance, Part 1. She smelled of aged tobacco, of chocolate and cherries, and jojoba oil. It made for a slightly nutty flavor Manos found oddly appealing. The oil had obviously been her father's preferred lubricant for his ship's hemp ropes. Keeping his back turned toward her, he hoped she'd take a hint and leave. He cringed, remembering how Marie used to follow him around. Thank God she'd grown out of that habit. He frowned, hoping he hadn't acquired a new shadow. My father isn't here either, he goaded, reminding her of their first conversation. Knowing she was likely scowling at the back of his head, he smirked. He couldn't say for sure why he enjoyed teasing her, but watching this self-assured runt get flustered made him smile. He'd seen her in passing at school, with Marie mostly. Each time, she'd reminded him of Yosemite Sam, but with a couple of dictionaries instead of six-shooters at her sides. Today, however, he would prefer to miss her turbulent jade eyes. He needed a minute to collect himself before facing anyone, and while his friends understood that he grieved, no one would ever see him cry, especially not this squeaky half-pint who had the gall to call him unfortunate. I thought you girls were headed to the bazaar, he stated, referring to his sister, Anna, and Lily. Weren't you all supposed to be picking up supplies for school or something? Using his undershirt, he wiped his face. Supposed to, Amanda mumbled, her voice cracking. Then why aren't you with them? He asked. Instead of hair annoying me, he wanted to add. They left without me, she growled. What? He squinted, shaking his head. Why? They're always doing that. Take your pick. I'm not old enough, not tall enough, she started to sing. Too much of one thing, not enough of another, she sighed, sounding bored now. I don't know. You get the picture. Yeah, get used to it, kid, he sighed, sympathizing. This was something he understood, but had no time for. Growing up, he'd always been too much of his mother, not enough of his father. For their neighbors, he hadn't measured up. Often, they'd underestimated him, just based on his genetics, assuming he'd be below par, and therefore not expected to continue the excellence that had been embodied in Sabine wines. Today, he had neither the time nor the patience to deal with those issues or her. Now hasty to be rid of those shadows, and this one, he'd intended to rebuff her, informing her that the unfortunate, destitute waif wouldn't be good company today almost made him smile, anticipating the storm that would brew in those eyes. At the reminder of the names she'd called him, he started to turn. As he faced her, however, the words wouldn't leave his lips. A fiery crown framed her copper face, and he could swear the dots of cinnamon freckles across her nose were a siren's call. Stunned into silence, he just stared. A minute later, however, he saw the swollen eye and the split lip. Stifling a gasp, he swallowed. What piece of garbage would do this? Manos fumed. And God help him when I find him. I brought my own money, she fumbled, then dug into her pocket, pulling out a wad of crumpled bills. They wouldn't have to buy anything for me, she wailed, disappointment lacing her words. Those swollen lips quivered as she flopped down on the dead branch next to him. Reaching for the undershirt he draped next to his sodden school shirt, Manos quickly donned the garment. Visions of his gran lurking behind every tree hastened his movements. It was still wet, but he wouldn't be caught dead half-dressed, seated next to a girl, regardless of how uninteresting or annoying she might be. Grasping the hand she'd been using to prop up her chin, Manos pulled her off the branch and led her away from the cliff toward a small clearing within the trees. Okay, put up your duke, he instructed, arms at his sides, facing her once they'd made it to the center. What? Amanda protested, squaring off with him anyway. Said dukes were positioned in the air in front of her chin. Sighing, Manos strode forward. She then took a few steps backward, putting at least 10 feet between them. Brave, but not stupid. Good, he reasoned as he walked towards her. From this distance, I couldn't easily get at her. Whoever hit her must have caught her by surprise. Your stance is fine, but you'll break your fingers like that, he said before reaching her with his hands up, fingers spread, giving her enough warning before grasping her hands. She was still in her school uniform, a pair of light blue and white checkered overalls with an inner yellow shirt and matching blue tie. She wore hers not form-fitting like most of the girls, but loose and long to the calf like his sister's. He smiled as he repositioned her thumb, preventing her from breaking those bones. Her fingers felt small and cold in his hands. Her expression looked sullen, the corners of her mouth downturned, her eyes focused on his hands. He noticed the eye that wasn't swollen. It looked red-rimmed and puffy. She'd cried. No doubt after she'd left her opponent, though, he figured. Tough girl. Good. Never let them see you cry. Holding her fist against his throat, he ordered, "Here." He steeled his features. He made himself look as severe as possible, remembering how he couldn't get Marie to stop laughing when he went through this same lesson with her. That had been an exercise in futility. "You aim here," he continued. "Because of your height and reach, always aim here. If someone comes at you or you find yourself having to throw a punch, with your reach, focus your force and momentum here. It would do the most damage." He stared into her red-rimmed jade eyes. They'll likely bend forward. Repositioning her arm, bending her elbow up and forward with his hand, he continued, as they gasped for air, "Aim for their temple or the back of their head. That should give you enough time to get away and find me," he thought, not meaning to, while knowing if she didn't, he would find whoever came after her anyway. Letting go of her arm, he stepped back. "Come at me." He would have laughed if it wouldn't have insulted her. The expression on her face was priceless. He could count all of the teeth in her mouth. It was open so wide. Her eyes were as wide as saucers. Well, the one that could still open was. Anyone would think he asked her to commit murder. Then he saw it. The moment she committed, the moment her anger and indignation took over, her eyes narrowed, her focus sharpened, her nostrils flared, and then she charged him. "Whoa there, Attila," Manos said, sidestepping her punch, but grabbing onto her hand so that her momentum wouldn't take her to the ground. "Why?" Amanda yelled as he whirled her around. "Why? I mean, how did you do that?" she asked, after gaining her footing. "Because I want to live," Manos answered, dropping the fist intended for his throat. "At least you listened." He was shocked. "What's behind that rage, kid? And you're not the giggly type, are you?" "Why?" he wondered. "Pay attention." He waited until she was once again focused on him instead of frowning at the ground. "Every assailant has a tell, something that will alert you to when and how they're going to attack. So you'll have to be observant, because it may be something as subtle as an increase in their breathing or the direction that they're looking. I'll lunge at you. Try to anticipate which direction I'll come at you from. Try to avoid me." "Okay," Amanda agreed, bouncing on the balls of her feet. "You sure?" He smirked. "You ready, Rocky?" "Yeah, come at me," she answered, frowning. Manos slowly lunged for her right side, but Amanda turned right into him. He caught her around the waist, lifting her out of the way to avoid actually tackling her. He tried not to laugh and failed. With each missed escape, she would get angrier and growl, making him laugh harder. By the 10th lunge, his eyes were tearing, but he could tell she was paying attention. "So, who's behind the shiner?" Manos asked, lunging for her left. "This idiot from school," Amanda answered, and twirled to her right. "He's not even in my class." She threw up her hands disapprovingly when he hefted her over his shoulders. She'd forgotten to sidestep him. After placing her back on her feet, he reminded her, "Focus." "Why aren't you willing to give up his name?" Manos wondered. Taking a couple steps away from her, he decided to try something different. "Let's work on your punches again," he instructed. "Okay, I'm ready," Amanda answered, fists at the ready. "I see," he smiled. "I didn't have to bend your arm." Taking another step back, he ordered, "Come at me." He sidestepped her advances a few more times. He held on to her arm with every wild lunge she attempted to keep her from falling. They were both working up a decent sweat, even though the temperature had dropped with the sun's descent. "Is it true?" she gasped, lunging almost a foot wide of his arm. "That wasn't even a close call," he complained, standing straight, flat-footed, not even trying to dodge her advance. "Are you paying attention?" She drew up short. "Is it true that you were awarded the Borrego Meritorious Scholarship?" she asked, fists at her side, panting. That wasn't supposed to be public knowledge. Manos grimaced. I haven't even told Gran yet. Hesitant to confirm anything, he turned and started walking. We should stop, he said over his shoulder. My friends obviously aren't coming this evening, and I need to wash my school clothes. It's Wednesday. Who does laundry on Wednesdays? She yelled. Not everyone has a closet full, he answered. Reaching his driftwood stoop, Manos scooped up his bag. He glanced back. Assured that she had followed him out of the clearing, he slipped the sack over his shoulder. Unfastening its buttons, he retrieved his tie from the bag and put it on as well. Glaring down at his shirt tails, he concluded that they would just have to remain untucked. She stood right behind him. Besides being awkward, he did have manners. Placing his hand atop his curls, he agonized over how to answer her question. How many people knew, he wondered. Well, is it true? She demanded. Turning, he frowned down at her. She'd been closer than expected. You know, for someone so small, you're awfully demanding, Squeaky, he said, waiting to see the irritation flare in her eyes. It didn't. That's an observation, not an answer, she retorted. I rest my case, he smirked, lifting his gaze skyward as he asked, how many people have you told? This has been Chapter 4 of Hope's Nocturne. We hope you've enjoyed. If you would prefer to know before next week what happens with Manos, you can purchase the book at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, or join us again next Thursday for Part 2